Donnell, and they're here to tell us about the history of his paintings and carvings. And now Jevoid is retired and has time to devote to us.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Today well first of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Davenport, Iowa. I have some family here, maybe some others who typically come a little bit later. But in any regard, my work that I've done from an art standpoint, I wasn't always an artist that I could practice it. I was working in, business sector and things like that. But I was always doing art on the side. So now it's been an opportunity for me to really get into what is my passion, and that's making art. And so what I have here, I'm going to talk about a couple things. I'm going to talk about this large painting here that is kind of a 14, 18 paintings in one. And then go across and break into these paintings as well and have some conversation about what those mean. And I will say this, that from an artistic standpoint, always having made art, there was a long time when I made art that was just fun. And now the times have changed somewhat, and it's getting to the point where art has to have a little more meaning. There are things that are going on within the country. Anybody that's listening to the news would have an idea of what's taking place in the country, the division and all of that exists. I have a little handout, actually, if you would take one and pass it out, because I'm going to use that to talk about this large painting. So, to start out, one of the things I want to track is kind of the trajectory that we've been on as a country in the United States. Starting from the very inception of the first permanent settlement on the continent, Pilgrims coming to, and they come with really nothing but the clothes almost on their back and supplies and things, and not even a plan for how they'll make it through the winters and stuff they come. But interestingly, there was a population already on this continent, about between 6 to 10 million indigenous people. But to our folks that came here, it was like open land, kind of land for the taking, and there are all kind of tribal rights and things that existed between various tribes. So you'd think that they would maybe be run off, but they weren't. They were kind of welcomed in Virginia, and they were there. But they had help from the native people who taught them, what should you be making here in this part of the world? And they gave them maize and different other things that they could focus on to survive. And that was a very good deal. That was very beneficial to the survival of the colony. Now, as things prospered and they began to grow, you move into a place where there's a need for labor, and as we get to the need for labor, we have certain people that are being brought in to be that labor pool that work for nothing, and so this is the start of bondage here in the country. Actually, slaves were being used in other parts of the continent, further south, but this was kind of like the first permanent settlement that brought in slaves to support the economic growth. And if you look closely at my pictures, I don't put faces on it, because the faces are anybody. It's all just imagine. And here I have a couple here being sold and one with her child, to just understand the magnitude of what it would have been like to be subject to that. We move on to here to the initiation of slavery and the work and how that happened, and the oversight that was required to do this. And one of the biggest tragedies, I think, of our country is the fact that we ever had slavery as a foundation. Now, the statement is that if you had not had a black labor force that was free and in bondage, it never would have become the economic powerhouse that it was. The North was as guilty as the South relative to slavery because the banks and all those institutions had prospered between England and so on and so forth. They were banks. And so it was a composite thing and everybody benefited. So the folks in the North couldn't assume innocence in any of this. They were part of it. Now, as you progress, I look at the wars that have taken place in the country, the war for independence. Now, if you look closely at the picture, you'll see that there are black as well as white fighting the British, and that was very common. They were going to be allowed to have their freedom often if they fought. Some of the black folks fought with the British because they said, you will be free now, you know. And it's estimated about 5,000 to 10,000 would have been on that side. But that was the layout. So we've had wars here, but Americans that are black and brown, they participated in all of that. So we've had blood in the struggle. So over here, when you get into the Civil War, one of the big wars that battles that stand out to me was Battery Wagner in South Carolina. That was the one where the blacks led the charge at Battery Wagner up to the base, which was a slaughter ground, and they were the point to take the shots going in, and it was a bloodbath. Massachusetts 54. There's a movie done about that some years back, which is very interesting. But to the truth, there's always been a participation very fully in all of the things that are important, that have been big events for the country. But you wonder how much that matters sometimes with where things progress. So after the war began to wind down, there was an edict that was given that said all former slaves would get 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman entered that field order in Georgia, but it just kind of fizzled out, you know, nothing happened with that. So just putting it out there that was that whole thing you hear about this thing about where's that 40 acres and a mule. So moving along, as we get to the Civil War, we have a situation where at the end of it, of course, President Lincoln was shot and killed. And his co-conspirators are listed out there. They're the only ones I wanted to put faces on because they were very visual kinds of faces. And from there, as you move over into what would be Jim Crow, it was the night of the terror. And that really started with the institution of the Klan. And that would have been in '65, literally. And the night rides and the terrors and so on were taking place at that point. And I shift here and talk about the native people. Now, from the point of the Europeans coming onto the continent, they began to push into those areas. And actually, starting out in Georgia and the South, they began to push them off to the west. And this was called the Trail of Tears, where they were moved to places that were not a part of their, you know, living situation or their familiarity. And you had, sometimes you're moving across what is other tribal lands, you know. But all of these things were happening with a government that instituted the ability to take away what was already owned by somebody else. And that was a big challenge. And it's still an issue. It's still an issue. And there's still the conditions that are for those individuals that are living on the reservations. And they're not good. So moving on into the time of Jim Crow and the black codes that came to be developed within the country. We had fountains where, you couldn't, to drink out of the same fountains in the same building. You couldn't eat in the same places where black and whites couldn't do that, you know. So there were these black codes that existed. And it's interesting, you know, if you look into it, segregation, it's interesting how things change, but they don't change at the same time. I'm thinking about even in Davenport, Iowa, when my family first moved north, we kind of escaped being lynched in the early 50s. The first job my father had was working in a Chicken Delight restaurant. It was segregated in Davenport, Iowa. He couldn't go in the front door to work. Black people couldn't either, but on the outside, there was, you know, integration. So my family was part of the migration out of the South, and we left ahead of probably what would have been a lynching situation. And we were a part of that. We left in 1952, when I was about 1 year old, under threat of violence from the Klan. But this picture here is just kind of detailing the whole flight out of the South, the great migration that took place, where ultimately, somewhere in the order of 20 million people, and over time ended up going north, leaving the South. Here we have the March for Freedom, for things, for integration, for being able to ride the bus, in anywhere in the bus. This is about 1954, the Montgomery bus discussion that was going on there. And in large mass, black people decided we're not going to do that. We'll walk, they cab, they got rides in trucks and things like that to fight the Jim Crow kinds of laws that were in place. And it wasn't without a fight, but they actually busted the transportation system because it wasn't feasible to operate without all of the people. And so they won. No more back in the bus. Here, in this slide, in this segment, I'm looking at the deaths that have occurred, and the deaths that are very suspicious, actually, as to who was involved in those deaths. Now, you have listed here, there are some that are unknown, but I have Medgar Evers, John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and can't read my own writing here. Robert Kennedy. Now you look at some of these, and these, to the best of my estimation, have been political assassinations. Certainly, Lincoln was killed for obvious reasons. You know, John Wilkes Booth, and slavery thing and all that, freeing the slaves. But when I think about John Kennedy, for example, we don't know who killed John Kennedy, but everything that is you hear about this is they don't really have the details. You know, they say John Wilkes Booth, not John Wilkes. Oh God, I went to the wrong person. Lee Harvey Oswald. They say Lee Harvey Oswald was the person, the lone assassin. Impossible. The gunshots don't match. I wasn't going to go there, but I think about what was going on when John Kennedy was killed. John Kennedy, he had just had a breakthrough with Khrushchev, and he wrote down the Iron Curtain. It was at a point when the two powers of the world were on accord that said, we cannot mutually destroy each other. We have to work together. We have to partner. Not long after that, he was gone off the scene. Now, when President Eisenhower took over and he was leaving the office, the message that he gave is, please be aware of the growing military-industrial complex. You must be focused on that. He was a person that was at the head of a lot of that, but he was recognizing that something is awry, and we need to look at that. So, moving down here, we're kind of in the modern times where we're dealing with, things like choice, the ability for women to have choice. And this is moving to the issues that we're really talking about a lot today. And so I've detailed out what I looked at is regular people, no faces, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, you know, but choice. And something that struck me greatly as I looked at all the things that happened when the MAGA situation took place at the Capitol, is to have someone fly that flag at the very seat of the government. And also, where actually black people actually have built those structures. And it just galls me. And the last slide that I have here, the tile that I have here, is really about the justice system. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the justice system today, about what it's doing and why it's doing it. I think that it's very interesting the amount of things that are given to judges and stuff like that, who vote on things that certain other people want to have happen. You have to question, you know, what is the balance? But I flew the flag in that segment upside down, and that's a sign of distress for the country. And I think it is truly where we are today. We're in distress, and I don't know whether we'll survive. I really don't. And that's a scary thought. And if it doesn't, what is the chaos that will be here if it's not managed in some fashion? Now, moving along, I think about what is it that we have to have happen within the country? How do we begin to reverse, or start to really try to reverse what's going on, the polarization? You know, we see things where in 1993, we got a visual idea of the impact of police violence on black and brown people. And yes, they beat up white people too. You know, they're good all the way around. But there's a targeted thing that seems to take place. This guy was on a joyride. And I'm trying to recall the guy's name. Into the audience?
Rodney King.
Rodney King. Rodney King, you know, was savagely beaten. And it would not have been anything, this was the first time it was really recorded. And I painted this picture for a program that was in Evanston that was kind of highlighting that. And you look at it, there was a little apartment complex back in the area where this was taking place. And there was a guy who took a picture and filmed it and made it available. I assumed it had to have been a black guy or something. It was a white man. And he filmed that and put a light on what was happening there. It exposed the horror that exists. And that has happened, and it still is happening today. But this was the first time you got a real visual picture of what it was. Now, when I think about what do we need to do as a people to survive as a country, this is one of the paintings that I came up with. And I did this one about a year ago. And there's a tombstone and it says privilege, racism, and supremacy. I had this up as an exhibit in Skokie, Illinois. There was a complaint that the curator came to me and said, there's a man that wants you to take the picture down. I said, why? You know, he said it's not appropriate for that environment, you know. I said, I'd be happy to talk with him. I said, do you want to take it down? She said, absolutely not. But in here I have an assembly of young older, farmers, business people, regular people who are standing in the graveyard. And behind them, there's a message with little black, white, Hispanic, Asian, saying the time is now. And what the picture is saying, we have to, people who are of Caucasians, white, have to really look at racism in America and think about the impact of that and what needs to take place. Certainly, there's work that has to be done in that regard. I'm not here to say anybody's a racist, but I'm saying that the country has that in its blood. And for it to be dealt with, it's kind of an in-group thing to do. It's not something that a person that is black can do, because I'll tell you the truth. Black people have challenges too, because some of the police meetings you see that are savage, done by black police officers. There is, I think, an element of self-hate among some too. There's work that needs to be done there. But what I am seeing in this picture, which I love to have fun with when I make some stuff, because Betty Boop is right here, Charlotte Chapman is over there, and here's Joe Biden, all in there, trying to, deal with this and bear it. And what I want to point out is it is not a condemnation at all, but it's a loving call to try to do this work, because we all have the work to do. But I think it has to happen really in a group. I go in a group and talk about these things, and say, well, what's his interest in this? Why is this? But I really want everybody to think about what is the responsibility in making this a better place. These things have to be acknowledged and dealt with, in a loving way. And when I wrote the narrative about this is not a condemnation. It's a loving call for brothers and sisters of common good to really examine this. And we didn't take the painting down, it stayed out. Now, how do we go about doing this on a broad basis? How do we maybe just show a little bit of love, a little bit of humanity? I think that the work that has to happen is to do what I'm suggesting here in this picture. It's called common, finding common ground. And sometimes you have to go into the dark, and look each other in the face and talk truth. Talk truth. And the reality is I think we start talking truth, we find that nobody wants me or anybody that looks like me particularly to be treated badly. I don't believe that. I don't believe that that's the case, but it happens. But how do we move beyond that? We have to have those kinds of things where we're willing to examine ourselves and look and see, what can I do different? How can I begin to bridge this gap? And you have to go into the dark space and be willing to talk and share. At the end of the day, I think we have more in common than we do than we don't. If you think about it, do you want my family to be chastised or treated badly? I don't think anybody would wish that. Good people thinking, and I don't want yours or black people, and so on and so forth. But if you understand that and talk about what your commonalities are, you want the best things you can have for your family. You want to see your children prosper, in this future, and so on and so forth. We all want the same things. But there are some things that get in the way of this, and I think that we have to watch and be careful about the chatter, because the chatter is something that wants to drive us apart. We create enemies back and forth in the media and so on, how things are horrible, being the whole woke thing and all this kind of stuff that's going on. So I think that we have to really look at that, finding common ground, because I think if we can't find common ground, it is my true belief that the country will not survive as it was intended to. We're at the crossroads. And this particular painting is the one that it's actually a friend of mine that we're in the dark space making this painting. So that is my presentation today. I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for what my art has been. Back in the back, I have art that is more of the stuff that I was doing that's fun, you know, to do. Family home, the book that I wrote for my family's migration story, things like that, and the carving. But as I said, it came to the point where for me, it was important to do that, but it was also more important to begin to talk about where are we going as a country, and what can I do individually to make this different. And that's what I want to share with you today. Thank you very much. So, I will take any questions you have. Yes?
How did your family decide to?
Well, Providence. No, actually, we had an aunt that lived in Rock Island that had migrated a couple of years earlier, she and her husband. And so when people moved from the south, they didn't go in just, you know, you had to have a plan, you know, so you went where somebody before had been. And so we stayed with them for about 6 or 7 months, very tight quarters, and ultimately we ended up in that house that I feature back there. It's a kind of a key picture out of the book that I wrote, 1404 Christie. Yes?
Can you give a little history like you did in your last program about why your family moved up?
Sure. Well, it was 1952. I was a baby at that point. I was about 7 or 8 months old. And my dad got into a confrontation with the shop boss at the sawmill where he worked. And he was accusing him of having botched a job that wasn't his work. And he kept trying to tell him it wasn't my job, you know. And the boss said, I'll take a pipe and bust you upside the head. Well, in that time, 1952 in Alabama, there's no reprisal for that. It doesn't cost anything if you do that. My dad said, I already got a pipe, and he ran him out of the shop. And that was the beginning of us having to find our way out. But if it wasn't for a white man, we would have perished. He came and warned us a few days before the Klan arrived. You got to get out. The Klan they're going to come and get you. He was a friend, you know, and that common thing, you know, when you know people, you know, and we survived. Dad had to go quickly. We went kind of back further into the woods with Grandma, my maternal grandmother, and stayed there for about 6 or 7 months before Dad could send for us. When we came out of there, two of my uncles, it's interesting when you think about the past, in a wagon drawn by horses, 2 horses in an open wagon, in the dark of night, they came with shotguns and escorted us to the train station, which was in town, probably about 5 miles away, and we came north. Other questions? Yes?
What can we do as individuals to help rid this big divide we have?
I think you have to talk to people. I mean, I think people are very insular in a lot of situations, and when people say things that, you know, you don't agree with, you say, you know, that's an interesting perspective. Can we talk about that a little bit? You know, you can't do it without talking. You can't do it with a megaphone shouting at each other. You have to be willing to talk with people. You have to be willing to cross the divide and have conversations. I mean, you have to be careful about that. You can't, you wouldn't want to go up to a person of color and say, I want to talk with you about what your life experience is. I mean, it needs to be a little bit different break into that, you know, but there are some shows I've seen where there was a couple that literally rented, they sold their home. It was a white couple, you know, they had a couple kids. They sold their home and they went on the road. I can't remember the name of it, but they traveled throughout the country and they met with people who were white, people who were black, and they just had conversations with them, you know, and learning and talking, you know, and there was a lot of good. They actually did a documentary on it. It's all filmed. I can't remember what it is, the title of it now. But you have to be willing to risk. And I don't advise pushing, you know, but get to know people. First things, very, very basic things. Hi, how you doing? You know, just normal. But I think when you do hear something that is off-key, off-putting, you know, no, don't stand by and say, no, don't do that. I don't agree with that. I had a situation when I was at, had gone into a hardware store in Evanston, and a woman came up. I was at the paint section. I was trying to get some paint to do a job I had at home, and there was a Hispanic man working behind the counter. It was busy. And a woman came up. She looked like she was probably 50s, 60s. And she walks up and she says, hey, can't we all agree that a place like, you know, Home Depot can have enough workers out here to take care of the people, that she says. And then she says to the Hispanic person, hey, Jose, you know. And she said, looked at me, I said, no, take that out of here. I don't agree with that. You need to leave. You know, you have to call those things, you know, when things happen like that. Yeah, it amazed me that she did that, you know, but don't agree. If it doesn't seem right, say so. I don't agree. I think you're in the wrong place, you know. I want to see this country survive. There's too much blood and sacrifice to happen all over the place of our forefathers, our parents, our grandparents, great-grandparents that fought and died for the country. And there is a great vision for it. And we haven't been all good. We haven't. We get concerned about how we use power across the world. I find out that we're fighting in places I didn't even know we were at, doing stuff, you know. And Eisenhower warned about that, the military-industrial complex. You know, we have all over the world with our Army, you know, and it's one where we have to wonder about what are we doing, you know, what's this about? And finally, I think one of the big things I see that would be very helpful is getting money out of politics. Even our judges taking tons of money from people who you're making decisions on about things that, you know, money. What was that law that came into effect some years ago? What was that?
Citizens United.
Citizens United, where a citizen, a corporation is a citizen, and this citizen cannot pay $100,000 for Mr. Thomas's mother's home. Citizens United. Yeah, that's where the money is. And in that reality, we do not become important. There are so many things that are going on now, global warming and stuff like that, and you tell the fossil fuels places, no, dig, 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 drill, drill, drill. The American people don't want that. The corporations want that. They want that, and we need to take money out of politics. And maybe we'll get people that will serve the public good. Questions? Yes?
Is there any bitterness, do you have any bitterness about what's happened to your family?
Not a bit. I can't live with bitterness. No.
Good to hear.
No, I'd have to be bitter about my wife sitting back there if I was bitter. She's white, you know, and I love her.
I'm glad to hear that.
and you know, but you have to look at people are people, you know. If you're bitter, you should work on it, you know, and do something about it, you know. talk about why you're bitter. If somebody's treating you bad or whatever, no. I don't have time for that. That's a soul killer. So I like to make art. If I can influence thought with art, then I'm trying to do my part. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, Jevoid, I love your carvings. Can you tell them when you got interested in carving and what that represents, the people in there?
Well, I bought just about half of the actual carvings, but they're part of what I call Sugar Creek folk art, folk people. And their family and friends over the years, some from the South, some are composite characters, but half of them are actual people because I have a very big family. There are 16 of us kids.
In your family? 16?
Yeah, 16 kids.
Wow.
And so we're all captured in, I didn't bring our family that's a part of Sugar Creek folk people, but they're in the picture that's back there. But yeah, it's
wonderful.
Other questions?
What's your art background like in high school? Were you an artist in high school?
No.
What did you do? Why did you?
I prepared for, God, what was I looking at that time? I was looking at playing football at Western Illinois, is what it was. But no, most of my work was kind of advanced college prep and all that. Yeah.
When did you make the switch, or why did you make the switch?
To art?
Art.
I've always done art since I was 4 years old. I remember that actually when I was in kindergarten, there was I made birds. It was the silliest, it was just a real simple bird, but I guess it was really big in kindergarten. If I can make the marks, it's like back, stomach, tail, legs, head, beak. Do the bird for me, okay. And then make the bird and sign it, But I always, it's been a part of what I do. I mean, it's kind of a grounding thing. It gives me focus, and I always told my close colleagues at work, pretty soon they're going to figure out that I'm not an employee relations director. I'm just an artist in drag. They figure me out, I'll have to go. So I went before they figured me out and retired. Yes?
Have you thought about doing phase 2?
Phase 2.
Of your family?
And this is Bill, my brother that lives at 1404 Christie, owns the house there. No, that'd be horrible. You know how many of us there are?
But could you, invoke some of the younger ones to take up that mantle?
Okay, I'll pass it on. You're in the audience. You take it on,
Well, I mean, because, got, a lot of nephews and nieces and,
That's artists.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
artists.
Well-
You ever talk to them about doing phase 2?
Them or me?
Huh?
Them?
Well, I mean, them doing it, but have you ever thought about talking to some of them that do art and see if they would be willing to take up the mantle of phase 2?
Sounds like a good idea.
Sounds like your idea.
Sounds like a good idea. I think you live with some of them.
So, just,
But that's my brother Bill and Renee, his partner.
That's good. One thing I wanted to say, I went to high school with Jevoid, and he had great grades. He was a great football player, a great track person, and then he went to Simpson College and played football
Yep.
and had great grades. He's an inspiration to all of us.
Well, actually, I went to Western Illinois first.
First, and then
And they wanted to play football all the time, even in the winter. That wasn't fun. So interestingly enough, Jeff O'Boyle, who some of you know, he went to Iowa State, I went to Western Illinois, and we both got interested in getting the hell out of where we were, and we ended up playing football together at Simpson College, which you get an education, we weren't playing football in the winter.
And he's an artist too.
and he's an artist.
Did you know it in high school and football?
I
Did you
knew
both
it,
know
I knew it
that?
actually, I got into college, because he had talked with me about a painting that he was doing of a farmer that is just beautifully
We
done.
have it here.
It's here,
Yeah,
you gotta see it. This thing is awesome, yeah.
I'll get it. It's a print of the actual painting
is with his family, and the frame was from the walnut from the family farm.
Oh, wow.
And we wanted it because we have so many rural people here in Geneseo, and so instead of, the person's name is Robert Carter, and instead of being named Robert Carter, he named it the American Farmer.
Yeah.
But I'll bring it in. We have a print here.
No, but we ended up at the same school, and there's some real adventures that we have had. We were recounting those about how we, at one point, dressed up in drag, high heels, skirts, wig, so we could get in the girls' dorm over the weekend. Yeah. I had a regular college experience. Other questions?
I have a real off-the-wall question.
Okay.
I admire you now that your art, you're using your art to pursue your passions, hopes for the future, which in the back of my mind, I'm listening to this, isn't Evanston like the only city or one of the city who approved retribution payments to blacks?
Yeah, it's one of that I'm familiar with, but in my mind, while it's an effort, it doesn't do as much as it needs to, because isn't that wonderful?
Yes.
That is nice.
Yes.
That almost,
We haven't hung it yet. Lee is, our technologist, is going to hang it and he does plaque work, engraving, and he's going to make a nickel shade plaque. There's Lee, and he's going to frame it and put the Jeffrey O'Boyle.
it's one, I looked at it and thought, I'm not as good as him.
No, you have a neat style.
Yeah, just wonderful. No, but relative to the retribution, for me, it's kind of limited. It is an effort, but it was really just focusing on probably 16 families, I think, that were qualified for it, based on their housing and having lost their house or something like that. So, no, there needs to be much more than that, but it's
No,
a start.
it appeared to be kind of a token effort, but the idea is everything you're saying, and we all need to get together and talk, we all need to get past all of these experiences, and I just thought maybe you were involved with this, it sounds like something.
No, I went to the meetings, when they were being discussed,
Yeah.
but no, I wasn't a part of that. But I think, go,
Yeah.
and keep going though, because there needs to be more. There are a lot of places in Evanston with redlining that happened, and that happened all over the country. But there are individuals that live in great neighborhoods where they got kind of pretty much ended up being driven out, and could not get into certain areas. And there's a lot of gentrification that's taking place. Northwestern, great university, your alma mater. You were up there when?
I graduated in '74. So.
Okay, all right, yeah. So, yeah, I would have been.
But it was very obvious.
Yeah, I
The
mean.
redlining, where, even me as a college student, because there were some really nice areas, they seemed to limit the blacks, I thought.
Yeah, and those places where black people did live have been really bought off, and everything, and it's gentrified in a lot of places. So, yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that.
Jevoid, you'd be great in politics.
Nope. Nope. I'd probably get shot.
You're very kind and very easy to deal with.
But I hope, though, just from what I'm saying from an art standpoint, really my hope is that people will talk, that people will talk to people who are of a different idea than what you are. And I think if we do talk, we'll find that we have a lot of commonality. And when we find commonalities more broadly as people, all of us, the barriers will start coming down, and the hackling will make less and less sense, where people are pushing very negative agendas and so on and so forth. And you can say, I don't believe in that. This is not what I feel. This is not what I see. But we have to stand up to that and call it what it is.
Well, thank you, you did a lovely job.
You're welcome.
Anybody wants to talk to you, they talk to him.
If you have any other questions, hang out for a while and go from there.
Is it? Yeah, nice of you to come.